Welcome to Crime Story with Camila, where we dive deep into the most chilling and mysterious true crime cases. If you love real-life crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring you the most in-depth investigations and untold stories. Imagine loving someone so much that you endure their worst, until one night, everything changes in an instant. A single moment of fear, rage, and desperation, and suddenly, there's no turning back. This is the story of Cathrina Cahill, an Irish woman whose love story ended in bloodshed. But was she a cold-blooded killer, or a victim who finally snapped? Let's uncover the truth behind the night that changed everything. Cathrina Cahill was a young Irish woman who moved to Australia in search of a better life. It was there that she met David Walsh, a fellow Irish native, and their romance quickly escalated. To outsiders, they seemed like the perfect couple, young, in love, and ready to start a life together. But behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but a fairy tale. Friends and witnesses later revealed that Walsh was controlling, jealous, and prone to violent outbursts, especially when he drank. He had a history of abusing Cahill, both emotionally and physically. But despite the escalating violence, she stayed. She later told the court she loved him dearly and always hoped he would change. There were warning signs. In 2015, just 2 years before the fatal night, Cahill had already been convicted of recklessly wounding Walsh with a glass candle holder. As a result, an apprehended violence order, AVO, was issued against her, restricting her actions. But even after this incident, they stayed together and the cycle of abuse continued. By 2017, the couple was engaged and living together in Sydney, but the toxic nature of their relationship had not improved. Then, on one tragic night, everything reached a breaking point. It was the night of February 18, 2017. Cathrina Cahill and David Walsh were at their home in Sydney, Australia, along with 2 other housemates. The group had been drinking and socializing, but as the night progressed, things took a dark turn. David Walsh, who had been heavily intoxicated, became increasingly aggressive. Those who knew him were aware of his violent tendencies, especially when alcohol was involved. That night was no different. Tensions escalated when Walsh suddenly became hostile toward one of their guests. Witnesses later described him as angry and unpredictable, picking fights without reason. Cahill tried to de-escalate the situation, stepping in between Walsh and the others, but this only made him more enraged. His fury quickly turned toward her. In front of everyone, Walsh punched Cahill in the face with such force that she stumbled and fell. The impact was brutal. She was dazed, humiliated, and in pain. But more than anything, she was terrified. This was not the first time he had hurt her, but the intensity of his attack that night was different. It was the kind of violence that made her believe she might not survive. Disoriented, Cahill got up and staggered toward the kitchen. Maybe she was trying to put distance between them, or maybe she instinctively knew she needed something, anything, to protect herself. Her hand found a knife on the counter. In a split-second decision, she grabbed it and turned back toward Walsh. By this point, Walsh was still aggressive, continuing to shout and lunge toward her. In a moment of pure fear, Cahill struck. The knife pierced his neck, cutting deep into his carotid artery. Blood gushed instantly, covering the floor as Walsh staggered back. His body went limp as he collapsed, choking on his own blood. Chaos erupted. The housemates screamed, frozen in shock. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on Cahill. One moment, she had been a battered woman trying to survive, and the next, she had fatally wounded the man she once loved. Someone called emergency services, but there was little they could do. Paramedics arrived to find Walsh lying in a pool of blood, his life slipping away. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Cahill, still shaking, was immediately taken into custody. As officers handcuffed her, she reportedly kept asking, "Why didn't I just leave him?" But for years, leaving had never felt like an option. Now, she had no choice but to face the legal consequences of what she had done. The question remained, was this an act of cold-blooded murder, or the desperate retaliation of an abused woman pushed beyond her limits? In the aftermath of the stabbing, Cathrina Cahill was immediately arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution painted her as a violent and aggressive woman, pointing to a prior conviction in 2015 when she had attacked Walsh with a glass candle holder. They argued that this was not a case of self-defense, but a deliberate act of rage. However, as the trial unfolded, the defense presented a much darker picture, one of prolonged domestic abuse, psychological trauma, and a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point. Witnesses testified that David Walsh was not just controlling but physically abusive, especially when he drank. Cahill herself told the court that she stayed with him out of love and fear, always believing he would change. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate Cahill's mental state. Their assessment revealed that years of abuse had left her mentally impaired, suffering from what the defense called battered woman syndrome. It was this psychological impact that led her to react the way she did on that fateful night. Faced with this evidence, Cahill eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. The court acknowledged that while she had killed Walsh, her actions were not those of a cold-blooded murderer, but rather a woman who had suffered immense trauma. In 2018, she was sentenced to 8 years in prison with a non-parole period of 5 years. For some, the sentence was too lenient. For others, it was a tragic reminder of how domestic abuse can push victims to the edge. As Cahill served her sentence, the case sparked conversations about domestic violence, self-defense laws, and the reality that many victims feel trapped in abusive relationships. The question remained, could this tragedy have been prevented if Cahill had been able to leave sooner? Or was she always destined to become both a victim and a perpetrator in this tragic love story? The case of Cathrina Cahill and David Walsh is a tragic example of how toxic relationships can spiral into violence, leaving irreversible consequences. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Why do victims stay in abusive relationships? At what point does self-defense become criminal? And how does the legal system handle cases where years of abuse lead to a moment of deadly retaliation? One of the most striking aspects of this case is the cycle of abuse. Cahill's testimony revealed that she endured repeated violence from Walsh but stayed because she believed he could change. This is a common pattern in abusive relationships. Victims often feel emotionally or financially trapped, manipulated into believing they have no way out. The fear of leaving can sometimes be more overwhelming than the abuse itself. Another important factor is mental impairment and trauma. Psychologists argued that years of abuse had left Cahill suffering from battered woman syndrome, a psychological condition where prolonged domestic violence alters a victim's ability to think rationally. This raised the debate about whether her reaction was truly an act of self-defense or a conditioned response to constant fear. From a legal perspective, the justice system struggles to balance accountability with compassion in cases like these. Cahill ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging that while she killed Walsh, it was not a premeditated act. The court recognized her history of abuse, but still held her responsible for her actions. The 8-year sentence sparked mixed reactions. Some believed it was fair, considering the circumstances, while others felt it was too lenient for taking a life. Beyond this specific case, there's a broader conversation about support systems for domestic violence victims. What if Cahill had received better support before things escalated? Could intervention from law enforcement, counseling, or a shelter have changed the outcome? Ultimately, the story of Cathrina Cahill is not just about one fatal night. It's about the warning signs that came before and the tragic consequences of a love story poisoned by control, fear, and violence. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a victim is in the arms of the person they love. The case of Cathrina Cahill and David Walsh is a heartbreaking reminder of how toxic relationships can lead to devastating consequences. What started as love turned into a cycle of control, abuse, and ultimately, fatal violence. Cahill's story highlights the grim reality that many domestic abuse victims face, trapped in relationships where they feel powerless to leave until one moment changes everything. While Cahill was held accountable for her actions, her case also shed light on the psychological toll of prolonged abuse. It raises important discussions about the legal system, self-defense laws, and the need for better support systems for victims of domestic violence. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Perhaps, if there had been earlier intervention, stronger protective measures, or more awareness about the dangers of staying in an abusive relationship. But for Cahill, the choice she made that night was one born out of years of suffering, fear, and desperation. As we reflect on this case, one crucial message remains. Domestic violence is a silent killer, and no one should feel trapped in a relationship where they fear for their safety. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, seek help, because no one should have to reach their breaking point before finding a way out.
Thanks for watching. For more interesting videos, please subscribe.